Alright guys, welcome back to class. Today we'll begin our discussion on another interesting dimension that connects China with contemporary global politics and even as we discussed an important bilateral relationship such as the United States, I think it is useful to remind ourselves that even though we credit China's miraculous economic growth with the pursuit of manufacturing oriented policies, export oriented policies, trade oriented policies, uh, infrastructure investment driven policies. Yet, if we look at where bulk of China's imports are concentrated, we come to this area of its immediate neighborhood, right? So, China trades a lot with its immediate neighborhood, even though its major export destinations happen to be North America, Western Europe, etc., its major sources of import are Southeast Asian countries. So, East Asia and particularly Southeast Asia therefore has a lot of importance as far as China's own growth trajectory is concerned. It might also be useful to remind ourselves that the different waves of reforms that were introduced in China were in parallel complemented by the kind of strategies that other East Asian neighbors were adopting. So, at that point in time, Japan, followed by South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, um, and Hong Kong, they were primarily looking to sort of send out capital, send out investment, relocate heavy industrial activity to China, which is where the region becomes extremely important in terms of generating a lot of growth. If you happen to recollect some of our discussions on concepts, I think the gravity model comes to mind. The fact that growth tends to be clustered in certain geographic regions owing to one obvious reason that there was proximity, the fact that there are sea lanes that connect these areas, making transportation quite commercially viable, and also the fact that these areas were enjoying differential stages of growth. So, some were extremely prosperous, had enjoyed industrial activity, they were moving on to services driven economy, and therefore the relationship with China becomes important. Now, be that as it may, the region still sees a lot of outstanding disputes as far as territorial claims are concerned. And while there might be one approach where we start listing that, with Vietnam they had a dispute in this particular year, with Philippines they had a dispute in this particular year, with Brunei these are the claims that they have, with XYZ these are the claims. But beyond that, one should try and get a sense of why this contestation continues to be a live kind of contestation. Why is it that the South China Sea is something that festers to this day, and what is the nature of dispute that one sees in that region? So, just to give you a legal backdrop, um, one reason why the South China Sea disputes continue to fester to this day remains around the importance of international legal concepts like um, the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which was ratified in the year 1994, and the purpose of such legal instruments was basically to get a sense that for every state that has a coastline, there needs to be a basis around which the state can claim that up to a certain extent would be my territorial sea, right? So the idea of a territorial sea was defined to be something that falls within a 12 nautical mile category. So within that 12 nautical mile category, nobody else has any right to enter without the permission of the state concerned, right? Then you move on to an extended area, which might be a contiguous zone, and then you go on to a further extended area, which might be an exclusive economic zone or an EEZ, right? So when you look at these definitions and the fact that, it is not too far back in history these concepts evolved. International law is a very dynamic discipline which has been evolving and which has allowed these states to function in a manner which makes maybe state behavior more predictable, maybe state behavior more organized, and it allows states to sort of deal with each other in a manner which is consistent, right? You don't deal with country X using a certain principle and you don't deal with country Y using another principle. So that is why such a body of law as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas became quite interesting to all the states, especially states that had a coastline. The idea of an exclusive economic zone, and the exclusive economic zone is defined to be a 200 nautical mile area. So the first tranche of area, which is the 12 nautical mile area, would be your territorial sea. And the exclusive economic zone, which is much farther, allows you the right to maybe have fishing rights, to have drilling rights. Nobody else can simply come and start drilling for oil or exploring for gas in your exclusive economic zone. So there was a need for principles similar to marking of land boundaries. I mean, the reason why we have boundaries passing through different stages, for example, just to give you an equivalent, when you have international boundaries, they usually pass through 3 stages, right? One is the stage of definition, right? If I have my neighbor as a person, assumed person, there has to be a clear understanding in principle that this area belongs to me and anything outside of this room belongs to my neighbor. That has to be in principle defined. Then, I mean, it's fairly understandable that simply having a definition between me and him is not enough. You need some paperwork to confirm the fact that yes, professor's territory is something that runs till a particular point, and you have to have some, maybe a municipal document or some kind of registry document which says that this guy has so much of land. So that is the idea of delimitation, right? Simply having a piece of paper again is not sufficient. You actually need to have physical markers like a fence or maybe some kind of a boundary wall that actually avoids any kind of dispute, because simply on a piece of paper, if I say my territory runs till that point, the other guy might just say that the line can run in any manner. It can include a piece of rock, it can exclude a piece of rock, it can include a water body, it can exclude a water body, right? Broadly, if you just go by something that is on paper. So that is where the idea of demarcation comes into the picture. So I just gave you an equivalent on land borders to help you understand that this was playing out in the minds of most states when they wanted some kind of clarity as to how they should define their territorial jurisdiction, especially when it comes to a maritime area, right? Land area, these principles are fine. In a maritime area, you cannot have pillars and you cannot have drawing of lines on the water. So you need to have some other principles which are basically driven by these ideas of territorial sea, which is very exclusive, and then a further going beyond that 12 nautical mile area, the idea of an exclusive economic zone, right? So this is what played on the minds of most states. And the interesting bit is that the calculation of your territorial sea or the calculation of your exclusive economic zone always happens from the last territory that you are able to legally establish for yourself. So if I say that my last territory is an ad block or some other geographic marker, my exclusive economic zone will be calculated from ad block till the main gate, right? But if I say that my territory only runs till the CRC block, then my exclusive economic zone only gets calculated from CRC to another 200 nautical miles thereof. So this probably helps you understand why states might be making claims in the waters over islands, some of which are not even fully formed islands, right? As we shall see in a graphic description subsequently, some of the places that these countries are claiming and counterclaiming are actually rocks. So in the water, if you have a high tide, you may not even see those rocks. It's only when you have a low tide that you actually get to see those rocks, and therefore it becomes very interesting as to why these countries have kept this to be a live issue for all of these years, right? So I think with those opening remarks, one can sort of get into the contents of the slide. So as far as the South China Sea dispute is concerned, the concerns of some ASEAN countries, the group of 10 countries, about China's creeping assertiveness and about the China threat has led them to deliberately invite other big powers in the region. So the fact that this is a live issue, the fact that there are contesting claims and counterclaims, and just to sort of deviate from this slide briefly to give you a sense of what visually we are talking about. Here we can see the area of the South China Sea and the respective claim lines that different parties to the dispute have. So if you look at this depiction, it becomes very clear. If you follow the red line, which has a couple of dashes, you would understand that that is China's reference to its maritime jurisdiction, the claim line that it has. So very clearly there is a Chinese claim line which goes far out into the sea, which contests the claims that other states are making. So if you look at a point like Spratly Islands marked as alphabet G on your graph, if you look at the Paracel Islands marked with alphabets J and L, if you look at the Scarborough Shoal marked with alphabets K and M, it's very evident that the claim lines actually involve areas that are disputed by even other states. So it's the same kind of claim that others might be placing on these areas. So there might be a claim that Philippines has over the Scarborough Shoal, which is contested by the Chinese because they say that their claim line, which they call as the 9-dash line. So historically, the basis of the 9-dash line, historically this was an 11-dash line and subsequently it gave way to a 9-dash line. And although the exact date for this line is disputed, some scholars suggest that this line refers to one of the Ming dynasty maps for that particular area. Now, if we wonder what these claim lines are based on, are they based on any agreements between states, in which case states should be respecting their agreements? These are not, right? These are individual claim lines, and in the case of China, for example, the 9-dash line here possibly refers to a depiction of their maritime outreach during the Ming times, wherein possibly their fisher folk were reaching out to areas as far as those represented within the 9-dash line. Similarly, for the Vietnamese, for example, the line which is denoted by the yellow colored area, which they claim as part of their jurisdiction, again reflects the idea that in the past maybe these were areas under the Nguyen dynasty in Vietnam, for example, right? So these are not lines that are strictly agreements that were made between states, and which is why it makes the dispute remain live, right? So had it been a boundary agreement that was signed between country A and B, today there wouldn't have been much reason for a dispute, because states, even though they pass on governance to the next dynasty or to the next ruling party, they have to sort of respect the kind of formal agreements that the previous government made. It cannot be the case that, suddenly you say that, I don't recognize that particular agreement because, I don't belong to that political party, or I was not part of the government at that point in time. It doesn't work like that. The reason it doesn't work like that is, in the international political stage, states are taken seriously for what they commit to, especially in terms of agreements, especially in terms of commitments that they make formally. If you as a state keep resigning on whatever you have promised, whatever you have signed, then on the international stage, other states will not take you seriously, because they'll say that, if I sign an agreement with party X, it doesn't seem to be the case that they respect any of these, and therefore you are not taken as a serious political actor. So those are the underlying concepts. And going back to the slide that we began with, over the years, we've seen involvement of other big powers. So that's a very interesting thing. When we were discussing even the United States, we had briefly alluded to the idea that the US, having left East Asia, in order to concentrate on maybe other theaters of war, such as Central Asia, have in recent years, particularly after the Obama administration, decided that, it would make a pivot back to Asia, right? So the idea is that there are states who feel that the vacuum created by the absence of the US has allowed China to become more assertive. Some of the critics would label China's behavior in this region, particularly when it comes to, and we'll see how they deal with claims and counterclaims. It's a very interesting way of dealing with claims. So, if you have a Vietnamese ship that is exploring for oil or gas in the waters that are claimed by, say, for example, China, you would have Chinese fishing vessels, or you would have other sort of Coast Guard vessels coming and doing things which might be seen to be very trivial, but that is how they deal with these claims and counterclaims. So if they come for exploration and they are sending down cables in order to explore what is under the water, the other party might just come and cut off the cable, right? So it's as trivial as that. And the good part about this is that all of the states, as part of an agreement they signed in 2002, which refers to as the 2002 Code of Conduct of Parties, they signed on to a commitment that they would not use military force to resolve the disputes that they have in the South China Sea. So that's the good part. But of course, how do they deal with claims and counterclaims when somebody else's vessel comes for fishing? Or for some other kind of exploration activity? You send your Coast Guard. If it's a cable that has to be cut, you cut that. If you have to literally physically stop them from entering waters, then it could be as trivial as using loudspeakers and blaring these announcements onto the other party till it becomes very difficult for the captain of the other ship to be in that area. So you blare these announcements through helicopters, you use water cannons, you throw water at such a high pressure that that particular ship and its crew is not able to remain stably in that particular area. So all of this sounds very trivial, but the good part is that instead of using military force, these are the ways that they use in order to enforce their claims and counterclaims, right? So over the years, we've seen renewed American efforts to revitalize bilateral security ties, and these ties have remained with major players like Japan, for example. The base in Okinawa comes to mind. Philippines, for example, although briefly they had serious differences, but off late in the last couple of years, again, the US-Philippine relationship has improved. And of course, the other parties like Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. Vietnam, for example, having an MOU to allow maintenance of ships, American ships in the Cam Ranh Bay, for example. These are the kind of measures they take in order to have some kind of a hedge. Traditionally, China has tried to discuss the issue bilaterally with each of the rival claimants, not wanting it to become an issue in the China-ASEAN relationship. So, as far as claims and counterclaims are concerned, the Chinese position has been that although In Southeast Asia, you have ASEAN, which is a very influential body of these 10 member states, including Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Brunei, and all of the others. But China says that because the legal title to a particular island has to be negotiated with a particular party, it is not willing to negotiate with the whole grouping as such, because the whole grouping per se doesn't have a legal title to a particular island. It has to be one of the claimants. It has to be Vietnam that has some kind of dispute with China for a particular island. It has to be Philippines, which has something to do with another particular island. So China says that we cannot discuss these territorial issues in the framework of the ASEAN, but they would like to discuss the issue bilaterally with each of these rival claimants. So this is how the area looks like. I separately have shared this particular slide for you to maybe zoom in and get to see what that area looks like in further detail. Just to explain some of the contents of the slide, China and Vietnam, they claim the entire area of the South China Sea. So I think the largest dispute that you find happening here is primarily between Vietnam. If you look at the deep yellow shade running up till the border pillar with China, marked as border pillar number 1, this is in Guangxi province, running up till there. I think visually the claims are pretty visible that that probably is the biggest outstanding kind of a dispute that exists, followed by the claims that Philippines has, and of course there would be other actors also who have minor claims here and there. Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei have overlapping claims to other significant areas. Philippines has a claim to the Spratly Islands, also called as the Nansha Islands by China. So here it's very interesting. The naming convention in these kind of disputes also is something that comes to mind. So if we have a major media outlet saying that today there was a dispute in the Spratly Islands, it basically implies that they are using a particular phrase that Philippines uses for that particular area, and so maybe their official stance is to recognize Spratly as the appropriate term for that particular area, indirectly saying that we don't sort of recognize Nansha. And if you find a media outlet referring to the Nansha Islands, it basically implies that they would like to recognize China's position as far as its claims over those islands are concerned. You have this dispute or debate over naming of areas very visible in other contested territories, right? So when you look at India and China, the dispute that exists in the eastern sector, for instance, in Arunachal Pradesh, whenever you have the Chinese making a statement relating to Arunachal Pradesh, they would always prefix it by saying so-called state of Arunachal Pradesh, right? And they would sort of call those areas as southern Tibet. So there's a naming convention that works in order to reinforce your claims. When we have to name those areas, we'll name it directly as Arunachal Pradesh. So this kind of a naming convention is something that normally comes into play for several disputes. I think the recent announcement by President Trump for the Gulf of America versus the earlier name Gulf of Mexico, I think it's important to bear in mind that naming conventions are very important to establish your sovereign kind of claim. So that is why today you have a big debate that Google has actually renamed that particular area as the Gulf of America, what used to be traditionally as part of the agreement that these states had earlier been named as the Gulf of Mexico. So I just thought that these naming conventions are important to bear in mind. Vietnam similarly, as I mentioned, insisted on a historical claim to the South China Sea based on contacts with the islands there during the Nguyen dynasty. On 12th of May 1977, it declared a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone and included Paracel and Spratlys in its territorial waters. The South China Sea disputes became a more serious issue in the early 1970s when it was discovered that the region may contain significant deposits of oil and gas, and Subsequently, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS that we had mentioned, which was ratified in 1994, sparked more intense conflict in that it set a deadline for submission of claims. So basically, um, what might have been a very dormant kind of an issue, what might have been routinely some kind of routine maritime navigation related um, focus, becomes a very economically contested kind of a focus by the time you have discoveries relating to underlying oil and gas. So, a couple of things. The reason why states, again, as I mentioned, would be interested in identifying their last point of sovereign jurisdiction to be far out in the sea would be to measure their exclusive economic zones another 200 nautical miles from that particular point. So if you simply claim that my coastline is in Chennai, then I can just measure my exclusive economic zone from there onwards. And who knows, maybe after a couple of 30, 40 years, based on improvement in either geospatial technologies or based on improvement in either exploration technologies. So today, if you have equipment that is able to go under the sea and handle certain bars of pressure, right? Bars is the unit that you use to handle pressure under the sea. Maybe 30 years down the line, you have other sophisticated instrument that allows you to handle several more bars of pressure deep down in the sea, and who knows, at that time you might be able to hit some kind of a jackpot as far as exploration of oil or gas is concerned. So, given the fact that technology is evolving, given the fact that these legal instruments are of recent vintage, these are not like, this is how international politics has evolved. It makes sense for these states to have a very strong claim or not dilute the kind of claim that they have, because even if today they might have limited rigs that they can explore oil and gas from, who knows, maybe in about 20 years, 30 years, technology and other facilities allow them greater access to find these kind of resources under the sea. So the economic argument, I mean, contrary to what some might say to be a very nationalistic argument or very irredentist, that I will not give up on my territory, contrary to that, here there is a very strong underlying economic reason, much of it because they really don't know definitively what might exist in those areas in the long term, and therefore they would like to not dilute the claims that they have. So I think with this, I will close the opening remarks for this segment. More when we meet in the next class.